thank you, Senator Welch. Appreciate that. We're really pleased that you're holding this important hearing today because bringing down the high cost of prescription drugs, it is one of my top priorities for Nevadans from Ely to Pahrump, all across our state. And as we continue to build on the successes of the Inflation Reduction Act, um, including allowing Medicare to negotiate for the lowest price of prescription drugs and capping insulin costs for seniors at just $35 a month. I'm really glad to see that there's a commitment in this committee to work towards lowering prescription drug prices for everyone. And I want to continue along the lines of Senator Tester and Senator Sullivan on the impact of PBMs on rural and independent pharmacies, because they're just a critical lifeline for our rural Nevadans. And in my state, like so many others, independent pharmacies, well, they serve not only as access points for rural Nevadans to receive their prescription medication, but they often provide clinical services like blood pressure, glucose monitoring for those with high blood pressure and diabetes. Unfortunately, between 2003 and 2018, more than 1,200 independently owned rural pharmacies across this country have closed, including in Nevada. In fact, there are many communities in my state that have just one or no rural pharmacies remaining. And so one challenge is that prices for what should be cheap generic drugs end up being higher for these pharmacies than the larger chains. I've heard from independent pharmacies across my state and in Reno who are going to work every day to provide patients with life-saving medication. But as a result of the current prescription drug reimbursement ecosystem, they are struggling just to keep the lights on and serve the people that they care about in their communities. And so, Dr. Oftebro, you're based in Seattle, but like in my state of Nevada, Washington State, you have numerous rural communities. They've lost their independent pharmacies due in part to the practices of PBMs. So, what are you hearing from your fellow pharmacists in rural areas across your state about that pressure they feel from current dispensing reimbursement policies?
Uh, Thank you, Senator, for the question. You're absolutely right. Our independent community pharmacies in our rural communities are vital lifelines, and Washington State is no exception. We have pharmacies in rural areas. We have pharmacies on islands. A good colleague, Rick McCoy, is on Lopez Island in the San Juans, and he is the only pharmacy on the island, and he was able to provide thousands of COVID vaccines during the pandemic. And he's struggling, and you know, if he's not able to be there to provide for his community, people on the island are going to have to travel hours via ferry to get to the next closest pharmacy. So it's absolutely a crucial issue, and we need to ensure that these rural pharmacies, who are the only access point of healthcare for many communities, remain viable.
Thank you. And I want to build on that, thinking about rebates, because they're intended to lower costs for consumers, but the reality on the ground looks very different for far too many families, and especially Nevada families. And there's limited federal transparency in the rebate process. So it's hard to know how we can best ensure savings from rebates that they're actually passed on to the consumer. So Dr. Trish, how can we ensure that rebate savings are actually passed on to the consumer in order to lower costs at the pharmacy counter? These are life-saving drugs. People need them, and we want to give them the best price.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I think all too often these rebates are not being shared at the pharmacy counter. We've done research showing the impact this has had, estimating that about half of Medicare Part D beneficiaries pay more out of pocket than they would have had rebates been shared with them at the pharmacy counter. Some of them about 20% on the order of more than $100 extra per year. Interestingly, it also has led to accelerated federal spending on the reinsurance program in Medicare Part D as well. So it has many, many different effects. I think, there are policies that could encourage or promote sharing at the pharmacy counter with patients. But I think the other thing is, as we heard, there is a bit of a game of whack-a-mole here. And so as we've shined more of a light on rebates, there's now contracts that at least require more rebate sharing with the plans themselves, but that's led to other types of fees and offshore rebate aggregators and all these other things where it's hard to keep up and make sure that once we focus on something, it's not just going somewhere else. And that's where we need kind of true transparency and a true understanding of where the dollars are flowing across the board.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I don't have time for any more questions, but I do want to have some explanations on this rebate administration fee. And so we'll put that for the record, because again, these can be the way that people are shuffling these charges around, ultimately hurting the consumer. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. The hearing